So today, our very special guest is neuroscientist and author Dr. Troy Rohn, and we will be discussing his latest book, Brain Medicine: Breakthroughs in Gene Therapy for Anxiety and Other Neuropsychiatric Disorders. Now, before we begin, Dr. Rohn, thank you very much for being here. And I wanted to start with a statistic you had in your book. And it said recent studies indicate that a considerable portion of patients suffering from anxiety remain untreated, with estimates suggesting that around 60% of individuals do not receive any form of intervention for their anxiety disorders. And approximately 22% of individuals with anxiety disorders do not respond adequately to conventional therapeutic approaches. So I'm assuming this is where gene therapy comes in, but I would love to hear your motivation for the book and why you feel like this conversation is needed right now.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for the invitation to speak on a very important topic, obviously. But when I was thinking about writing this book, really, I had two main reasons. The first reason was just as you said, I didn't feel for my, you know, scientifically speaking, I felt like gene therapy was a promising approach to potentially adding a new tool to the toolbox for anxiety, and you know, demystifying the science behind gene therapy was that was a huge goal. I remember when I first helped co-found our company, Cognigenics, in 2019. We were trying to raise capital, and so I remember one of our first times we met with some angel investors, and there were three teams. There was our team, and then another team that was pitching a phone app, and then a third team that was pitching, I don't know, it was some kind of like toilet bowl app, a tool or applicator. And here we come in, and we're trying to pitch to these guys about gene therapy, and it just like went right over their heads.
Mm.
And needless to say, we didn't get any funding. But I think it really kind of opened my eyes that, it is a very complicated science, like understanding what gene therapy is. And so that was a main goal, was to try to like demystify the actual science. The other main reason why I wrote the book was my own personal kind of story with anxiety. And so, I just felt like the timing was right to kind of bring these two together, in terms of both the science and gene therapy, my own personal story. And so that was really
Mhm.
what drove me to write the book.
Okay, and we're glad that you did because I was reading your book and you mesh together really nicely the science behind it, and you used great metaphors and analogies and your own personal story. So it read, very nicely, and I would encourage anybody who wants to learn more about gene therapy to pick up your book. So most of the people on the call are behavioral health professionals. And I know I went to grad school 20 years ago, so hopefully some has changed. But we didn't really have a lot of courses in like brain science, chemistry, especially not gene therapy. So, as I guess simply as you can explain it, what is gene therapy?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I think the uh, important thing to understand is that, when we think about psychology, what I tell people that, it's really what's happening at the molecular level, right? So it's our genetic makeup, our DNA, it's chemicals, neurotransmitters, and it's these receptor proteins. And, all of these things are happening at the molecular level to really drive how we feel and how we behave. Um, and so when we talk about gene therapy, the idea here is that what it really allows you to do is to have precision. Okay. So, for example, I currently have anxiety and prescribed Zoloft. And you guys know what Zoloft is. It's a SSRI. It boosts serotonin levels throughout the brain. Um, but it's not just the levels of serotonin that are important. It's what serotonin actually interacts with, these specific protein molecules. And that's what gene expression really can control, is the level of those specific receptor proteins. And in our brain, we actually have 15 different serotonin receptors. And I speak about serotonin because that's really the key neurotransmitter that's involved in mood and in the underlies a lot of these things like depression and anxiety disorders. Um, the problem is that we think that anxiety in those brain circuits that give rise to anxiety, it's really one receptor, the 5-HT2A receptor, that's really implicated. It's overactive. And so what gene therapy allows you to do is potentially turn down that single receptor. So instead of like having this um, drug, this SSRI that's boosting serotonin everywhere and potentially acting on all 15 of receptors, what we're trying to do is come up with a precision therapy that tunes down a single receptor. And the idea behind that is that you're going to get better outcomes, you're going to get fewer side effects, and you may actually have a much longer term duration, right? So that's really what gene therapy is all about. It's about precision therapy, but also about personalized medicine. Um, and that's really where medicine is heading. Is if we think, for example, there's a therapy for certain types of cancers called CART therapy. It's it's just blowing up right now. And what scientists do in that case is they actually they take their patient's own immune cells, genetically modify them for that specific cancer, and then inject them back into the patient, and their own immune system attacks that cancer. And so this is what is, has the tremendous promise with gene therapy, is that it can become personalized to that person, their genetic makeup, their wiring, their potential receptor expression, but also it gives you the opportunity to have like very, very strong precision.
Okay, so much more individualized and targeting only like one of
Yeah.
the 15 receptors.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so the analogy I like to use is like, instead of kind of rewiring, the entire your entire house, it's like fixing the single faulty circuit.
Mm, okay.
And that's really what gene therapy is all about. It's about precision. Now, we already have therapies available for things like sickle cell disease, for muscular dystrophy, certain forms of cancer, and altogether, there's about the FDA has about 20 approved gene therapies for a number of different disorders, but there's thousands more that are in clinical development, like what we're doing. But it's important to understand that the brain, obviously, in terms of mental health, the brain is much more complex, and so it's going to be we have the platform, we have the model, but we're just beginning to apply it to the brain.
Okay. Could you speak a little bit more to how the gene therapy would help with the side effects of different, instead of like the SSRIs? And what would that look like for the client or the patient?
Yeah, again, I think you're never going to get the goal of any kind of drug development is to have it do the only thing that you want it to do. Like in this case, it would be to reduce anxiety. But the problem is that a lot of these neurotransmitters and these receptor proteins have other functions in the brain. But what you can try to do is, you can kind of try to limit that by, instead, again, targeting a whole family of receptors or different kinds of receptor proteins. You can target a single molecule, and that in itself, uh, could reduce side effects. So again, when we think about the SSRIs, they're really boosting serotonin throughout the body, throughout the brain. And the other way that you can get precision and fewer side effects is how you deliver the medication. So we're actually using what's called intranasal delivery. And so we're trying to target the gene therapy directly into the brain. And what we've seen in animal models is that when we use our gene therapy to kind of tune down this one serotonin receptor, not only do we reduce anxiety in these animals, but surprisingly, we also greatly improve their memory. And that was, again, that could be looked at as a side effect, right? But that's because we know serotonin is doing other things besides just mood.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that whenever you can, the more precise you can be with a medication, the fewer side effects that you're probably going to see in the end.
Okay. So from if therapists and behavioral health clinicians look at kind of anxiety from this lens, how, or maybe if you have a case study, how is this going to impact what we do with like cognitive behavioral therapy, or traditional talk therapy? Like what would I guess, a gene therapy client look like for us?
Um, yeah, I think, one of the things I talk about in my book is my own personal story with anxiety. I feel like, seeing a healthcare provider or professional is just so important. And what we need is a holistic approach. And I think what therapy can do is it can really help you recognize the patterns of your thoughts and your emotions that are driving the anxiety. And what neuroscience can do is kind of help you understand why. Why is that happening at the brain level? So I think what what we really need is an integration of both. Like the counseling is important because not only does it kind of get to the root of why you have anxiety, for example, but it also can provide you the tools that you can use when you're actually in a situation where the anxiety is like coming on strong. And for example, in my case, I talk about how I have a kind of anxiety that's called situational anxiety. And one of the things I don't like to do is like be around lots of people, groups of people. Like going to a concert is like really challenging for me. And what I learned through counseling is that, the cognitive behavioral therapy where you're visualizing that process. So you're visualizing, how am I going to get to the concert? Where am I going to sit? Who am I going to be interacting with? And that visualization process, really can help reduce my anxiety. But then integrating on top of that, you know, newer medications that really target and help. Like for example, I'm on a SSRI and it doesn't really do anything when I have an acute anxiety attack. And so just I think realizing that this is a biochemical problem, and can we do better? Why are we settling for these decades old drugs?
Mhm.
So again, I think that's kind of what motivated me is trying to not just accept the status quo, but looking for new treatments that really impact anxiety, especially for those people where the SSRIs don't really work.
Mhm. Okay. So it's kind of a misconception that if we go down the road of gene therapy, then, all the problems of anxiety are going to be fixed. Like somehow, sometimes people think about that, like, oh, if I take a pill, right, I don't need counseling anymore, everything will be better. But what I'm hearing you say is that it's still really that holistic combination of this is a better way to target things at the brain level, but you still need the counseling for the cognitive, like behavioral part of it.
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it's an integrated approach that is going to be important, and layering in these new technologies, not just things like potentially like gene therapy, but all the new kind of digital tools that we have to help. So really just kind of looking at and again individualizing based on a person's their own kind of genetic makeup, right? That's where medicine is going. Is that we want to be able to tailor deliver the medications based on the person's biochemistry, their own kind of genetic makeup, if they have genetic risk factors. And so again, just really looking at a more, again, an integrated approach. It's not invalidating therapy at all. What it's doing is adding context.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Now, so when we talk about gene therapy, even if you Google it and discuss it, these ethical concerns come up. Could you speak to what those might be? And are those concerns kind of what's getting in the way of the progress for gene therapy? Like everything you're saying sounds wonderful. So I'm thinking, great, why can't we just get this going right now? Everybody would be better off.
Yeah.
So what are these
Well,
obstacles in the way?
yeah, that's a great question, Courtney. Uh, and I spent a whole chapter in my book talking about ethical considerations, and I think that it takes a little bit of understanding in terms of the different kinds of gene therapy that we have. So there is a type of gene therapy called CRISPR that actually changes the actual DNA in our cells.
Mhm.
And that's a permanent one time. We look at sickle cell disease, for example, that's CRISPR. But then there's another layer of management under that DNA, which is RNA therapies. And the RNA is different because it's kind of the middle manager. So DNA says, go out and make this receptor protein, and it dispatches its instructions in the form of RNA. Well, what RNA is it's kind of like Snapchat. It does that job, and then the RNA is degraded. So it's not a permanent change. And, people are much more comfortable with that kind of approach than actually going in and playing God and modifying the DNA. But in terms of the other kind of ethical thorny issues, one of them is access. So these therapies right now are really expensive. If you look at the treatment for sickle cell disease, again, it's a one-time cure, but it's over $2 million to undergo that procedure. So who's going to have access to? How do we make sure that everyone has access to these new therapies? Because they're not the old, my parents, grandparents medications. These are very complex genetic molecules.
Mhm.
Another, ethical issue is just um, what's the difference between treating a disorder and cognitive enhancement? So, for example, we've already shown in our studies that we get this tremendous boost in memory. Well, can we, where's the line where just normal, healthy people can take advantage of that?
Mhm.
That's an important ethical consideration. And then, I think when we talk about just the ethical issue is should we be changing personality traits? The thing about anxiety is it's adaptive. It's meant to be there. It's a fear response. It helps us escape potentially dangerous situations. Um, we really don't want to remove anxiety completely in individuals. I don't think that would be a good thing. And so, and that's another really important ethical issue is should we be changing these personality traits and to what degree?
Okay. So going back to like the playing God, if because anxiety can be, passed down. If you, I guess, correct someone's anxiety, and like you said, we're not going to take it all away, does that then have the potential to not pass it down to other generations?
No, because that's when you're getting in the weeds a little bit there. I love the question, but that means you'd have to actually change the DNA in the
Okay.
gametes, the sperm or the egg. And so, what most gene therapies are designed to do is to treat only the individual and to target cells that are already there so that any kind of change couldn't be passed down.
Okay.
But theoretically, you could, gene therapy could absolutely do that if you are modifying the DNA within the actual gametes, the egg or sperm.
Okay.
But that's not our goal. And I think, most gene therapies are being designed to really treat disease, disorders, cancer in people that aren't actually going to be able to pass those changes along
Mhm.
to future offspring, if that makes sense.
It does.
Um,
We one
but
question.
that does take a little bit, like you have to purposely design the therapeutic so that it's not targeting, for example, um, the gametes, the sexual reproduction organs. And again, that all has to do with the fact that when we talk about gene therapy, and the FDA, the road is long and safety is the paramount. And so those are all the things that we have to ensure before we'd ever, have something approved, and is approved,
Mhm.
that they're safe.
Okay. We have one question. It says, how do you know which serotonin receptor we need to target? Is it only the 5-HTA receptor?
So it's a great question. It's the 2A receptor, 5-HT2A receptor. That's been, if you look at kind of the anxiety circuits in the brain, in the limbic system especially, um, it's definitely the literature, the research shows that it's the 2A receptor that's heavily involved, in that it's an overdrive, that's overactive. And I talk about this in the book. Um, and we know that this receptor also is critical, not just for anxiety, but for depression and in schizophrenia. Now, is it the only serotonin receptor? No. So there is also evidence that the 1A receptor may be implicated as well. But based on the preponderance of evidence in the literature and in peer-reviewed studies, the 2A receptor is really the receptor that we should be targeting, especially for anxiety.
Mm. Okay. Thank you.
So that's based on empirical research,
Mhm.
right? That really supports that.
Now, when you were writing this book, because obviously you have the background for it and also the personal experience with anxiety, were there any moments that even kind of surprised you or like aha moment or thinking, wow, this is going to be really, great for people with anxiety?
Um, I would say that, yeah, I really, not while I was writing the book, but I remember the when we got back our first piece of data, as a company. We were doing experiments in mice, and when we saw a significant reduction in anxiety, I think that was a really aha moment. Uh,
Mhm.
and then when we subsequently found this huge improvement in memory, um, that was another really aha moment. But I think in terms of the book, um, I think what surprised me most was really, for me, was more of how personal it became. And in fact, I remember when I wrote the kind of the first completed draft, solid first draft, I had a professional editor that um, was looking at the organization and, just a pro, right? Because I'm not an editor. And she's like, Troy, this is like way too triggering. Like, she was like, I was just like, I had all this vitriol for my mom because my mom is really kind of the important player in my anxiety, growing up. And she was like, you can't, this can't be a book, a vendetta type of book. And if your personal stories don't resonate with what the science that you're talking about, then you really need to pare that down. So, because each chapter I write, I talk about some kind of personal vignette of my own anxiety. And so, I basically had to, like, I guess, edit it from rated R to rated PG. Um, but I think that was really what was revealing to me, was it really gave me an opportunity to kind of personally to kind of cathartic experience. And I didn't expect that. I thought it might be all about the science. And it wasn't. It was more about my own kind of personal revelations of my own experiences.
Like I said at the beginning, you do a really nice job of putting the two together. There's,
Yeah, and I think that's what makes the book unique,
yeah,
but also it makes it kind of hard. Like, who's the reader for this book? Like, my editor, my book agent was like, "Who in the heck's going to read this book?" And I'm like, "Well, I didn't really write it. I wrote it for this is the way I wanted to write the book, and I was not going to change that." But um, yeah, it really makes it interesting because it's really a mix of my own personal experiences, but also the science,
right. And
So
I think for therapists, like I said, I really enjoyed it because you have that, you have the brain background and you're explaining things very well, but it's not just that. So it gets so overwhelming. It also has kind of that like clinical feel of like, okay, how can we best help, our clients?
yeah,
Other question. Are there other methods for suppressing the anxiety gene, like exercise? So is like physical activity a form of gene therapy?
I love that question. So, one of the things that we talk about is that it's so this receptor, this 2A receptor I'm talking about, is excitatory in the
Mhm.
brain, and it's an overdrive. And and we can see that, like, for example, if you use like an EEG, right? Um, and really what we're trying to do through gene therapy is put the brain into what are called theta waves. And what theta waves are is it's a brain activity level to which when people are meditating, for example. And we know that when you are in this theta zone, right? There's clarity. Your memory is going to improve. Your anxiety is going to be reduced. And so when people are meditating, they're doing yoga, whatever, that's really what they're trying to do. They're trying to get in that mindset. Well, that's hard,
Mhm.
right? So again, let's help them a little bit with gene therapy. But to get back to the question, um, these lifestyle things are huge. And before I became this anxiety person, my real background is in Alzheimer's disease.
Mhm.
And we have a saying in Alzheimer's disease that what's good for the heart is good for the mind. And so when we talk about exercise, when we talk about nutrition, we talk about getting the right amount of hours of sleep. These things are huge for brain health, and they kind of set the foundation. And if you don't have that, then you're really going to be much more susceptible
Mhm.
to things like stress and anxiety and depression. So absolutely, lifestyle changes are really important. Again, holistic approach.
All right, another question. What is the duration of the effect from your treatment pathway? Is chronic dosing necessary?
Yeah, that's another great question. Of course, we haven't tested it in humans, so we don't know. But what we know from our animal model, rodent models, really, that we've worked with, that really interesting is that what we do is we would treat them intranasally on day one, but we wouldn't actually measure their whether or not their anxiety is reduced until 5 weeks later. Um, and we were able to see effects on par with like benzodiazepines. And we know that the effects last at least in mice 8 weeks, which again you have to be careful because that's like 3 years in humans. So we think that the therapies are going to be they're not going to be interminable, but they're definitely going to be, we've estimated anywhere between 6 and 12 months would be kind of the expected dosing interval. But
Mhm.
again, we won't know that until we move into clinical trials.
And do we have any idea when, like, what's the time frame on that? If you can say.
Yeah, again, the road to approval from the FDA is long and expensive. So we've already been going at it for 7 years now. And the average is about 7 years for most biotech companies.
Okay.
But we're working on a study right now. I'm not going to say much about the study other than to say that it's the most complicated study I've ever been a part of. And based on that data, if we get a positive signal from that data, which is actually it's launching next week, we anticipate that we could theoretically begin phase one clinical trials within 1 to 2 years.
Oh,
So it's coming, right? And that's the thing I talk about in gene therapy is that you're not going to, as you know, it's always hard you can't stop technology. Um, it's happening. It's already here. It sounds futuristic, but it's a real thing. And it's just a matter of time before we can begin to apply it to these psychiatric disorders.
okay. There's a follow-up question. Do you think previous dosing could have an effect on subsequent dosing in terms of frequency or duration?
Well, I think one of our main concerns, again, great question. So these are the same type of questions that investors ask us. So one of the things that we are concerned about is it really depends. One of the things we worry about is that you're going to get some kind of immune reaction because, again, these are not like small chemicals. These are complex molecules of either RNA, DNA, and protein. So we're a little bit we are concerned about the fact that you may produce antibodies against the therapy, and so subsequent doses may affect that. And so again, we are already trying to design the therapies that can kind of elude the immune system. And the main thing I think is this intranasal delivery. So I spent a whole chapter on intranasal delivery because this is really cutting edge to try to deliver things across the brain, as many of you know, is a major hurdle because of the blood-brain barrier. And so intranasal delivery is really one of the ways that you can bypass the blood-brain barrier, but also help mitigate these potential, immune reactions to the actual therapy. So again, these are all great questions that we know from our rodent model studies that um, they we don't see any big red flags, but until we progress towards humans, we're just not going to know. But what we do know is based on other people's work. So about 2 weeks ago, I was reading news articles, and a news article from CNN came up that showed that the FDA just approved a new gene therapy for children that are born deaf. And what it does is it delivers a gene that these children are missing, and they can hear again. It's just amazing. And I went and looked at the study, and they're using kind of the same components that we do. And so again, that's how you're kind of like piggybacking on foundation of others, right? So we already think that these gene therapies are becoming more and more acceptable by the FDA. They're proving to be safe. But again, every medication is different, and you have to do the studies.
Now it says, well, therapy only affects at the RNA level. How do the effects last 6 months?
Yeah, because well, that's a good question. So the RNA therapies, we don't know how long the actual So we use what's called a uh, um, siRNA molecule, and that can actually last longer than typical RNA in the cell. But also, you're getting downstream changes in receptor density and the 2A receptor density, as well as kind of the rewiring of the brain as it adapts. And so, those are more long term changes that we expect that why the therapy would be maintained for a duration of potentially months. Now, again, we also have designed a CRISPR therapy that actually goes in and selectively knocks down the actual DNA gene, and of course, that would be permanent. But we decided we have not progressed with that therapeutic, just again because of the unease that that therapy represents. When the FDA thinks about CRISPR, which is changing the DNA, they want it to be like a life-threatening disorder, right? Well, anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, these are really tough disorders, but they're not lethal per se. And so that's why we had to like move down to RNA. But again, I want to remind the audience that it's really more about not necessarily the duration, but the precision. And I think that we're going to see much better outcomes with a gene therapy type of medication than we have right now for drugs that, frankly, as you said at the very beginning, your first thought was you have 30 to 40% of people that don't even respond. What are
Um,
we going to do for those people?
right. Now, what about with trauma? Can gene therapy help with like anxiety related trauma, or is it different because of like different PTSD symptoms, or like how would this help with any kind of trauma clients?
Yeah, so I think you're I mean, that's really a question for you pros, Courtney, not my question would be, well, is the 2A receptor involved? So, I'm not a practicing provider like you guys are. So, I don't know, but certainly PTSD is a anxiety disorder. And so we would expect that, and we know that that the 2A receptor is involved in PTSD. So I don't see why it would not be an effective medication for those folks either.
So now talking about being a clinician and a behavioral health provider, what can we do now to kind of better prepare ourselves for having these conversations with clients or knowing more about it? Do you think there's, specific training that we need more of or a different like lens to look through while we're doing therapy? Like anything specific that you think we should really be doing to, kind of best help our clients if and when, hopefully when,
Yeah.
therapy becomes our go-to.
Um, that's a good question. So I guess I would flip that onto you. And do you think that your colleagues are getting enough neuroscience training? And maybe it's not like I know you guys know a lot about the brain in general, neurotransmitters, receptors, but maybe the gap that needs to be bridged is more about the nuts and bolts of gene therapy, right? What is CRISPR? What is shRNA? What is siRNA? Well, what are these different modalities of gene therapy, and what does gene therapy represent? I think maybe, and I don't know. I'm asking you. That's a good question for you guys. Do we need to bridge that gap?
Actually, that would be if people are willing to put that in the chat, I would love to hear people's responses or just even like a yes, we need more training or no, I've been trained in this because I would think that we do need more training on it for sure. And I know, like you said, it really has to be that holistic approach because in the past it's been so separate. As a licensed clinical mental health counselor, obviously I don't prescribe medication. And so I have a general understanding of it and how it affects my clients, but I don't have those skills. And I think as we go on further with this, I think we need to be better equipped. So at least we know, the basics, more so than just, the amygdala is what goes off when we're anxious.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting if people could put in, if they think that there should be more, required training. We have some yeses coming in.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think again, I think maybe once it's really realized, once we have medications that are gene therapy based for neuropsychiatric disorders, then that would be like the time where, okay, let's do some continuing ed,
mhm,
right? But again, that's why I wrote the book too, was I wanted to try to demystify this whole thing about um, what is gene therapy. And, you know, don't tell my publisher, Hatherley, but I actually made available my book so I taught this year, I taught a non-science university foundation course called Brain Matters. I had
mhm.
100 students in
Wow.
and I made the book required. Like I gave them access to the book,
Yeah.
basically. And one of the things I did was I actually polled them, each chapter, like, did you understand the science? Because again, that was a big goal of mine. Was I wanted to make it accessible, and I was happy to see that. By far the majority of these students were like, yeah, I got the science. Not all of them, but the
Mhm.
majority of them did understand kind of the explanations that I was providing to them. So, and again, I think with that comes understanding, right? When we can understand something, it kind of removes kind of the mystery and the stigma of really what gene therapy is about.
Right. Well, I think your book is a great place for all of us to start, learning more about it. We're coming up on an hour, so if anybody has any final questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. If not, Dr. Ron, I'm wondering if you could just give us kind of a few takeaways, from your book, or what you think as behavioral health professionals we should really kind of learn from the book, or things that we could put into place, right now.
Yeah, I think for me, again, it's this personal story, um, about my own personal experience with anxiety, and sharing that with, for example, my students. Um, one of the sought counseling, it was as a biological disorder that, not what's wrong with this person, but what's going on in this person's brain.
Right.
I think that's something that's really important that we don't lose sight of, that we don't lose sight of the biology, right? The cognitive therapy, that's really hugely important, but bringing in the neuroscience, really this integrated approach, I think it can reduce um, the stigma, if you will. Like, right, we need to talk more about mental health as a medical disorder, and not a personality flaw or a weakness. And so that's kind of what I'm doing. I'm showing my students, talking about having my story out there. It's not easy, but then having students come up to me and say, "Hey, your book really resonated with me. I have anxiety too," and just that connection and that's one of the things I love about this younger generation, by the way, is that they're much more open to talking about their mental health
Right.
than ever was my generation or my parents' generation. And I think that's a huge thing that we need to keep sight of.
I agree. All right, with no more questions, you answered everything. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time. And for everybody else, we hope that you join us next month for our next clinical conversation.